Good morning, everyone. Really great presentation so far, isn't it? Very thought-provoking, stimulating. Hopefully I can contribute somewhat to the discussion this morning. And I'm trying to bring a slightly different perspective, and it's probably pretty unpopular, but it's the perspective of a project proponent or an infrastructure provider. So I'm trying to wear two hats, I guess, simultaneously this morning, of one of being the sort of impact assessment professional, but the other of also being a good corporate employee. So I'll try my best, and hopefully I don't fail in both regards. But I have the privilege and benefit of working on a fairly substantive piece of infrastructure in Australia at the present time, and it's the Inland Rail project. It's a fairly substantial investment in rail infrastructure in Australia. It's 1,700 kilometres long, and it's really about encouraging a modal shift of the future freight on the eastern seaboard of Australia from road onto rail, which I think we'd all agree would have some pretty substantial sustainability benefits for the nation of Australia. But 1,700 kilometres is pretty massive, right? So for context, perhaps for people overseas and even people from Australia, 1,700 kilometres is the total length of New Zealand. If you're from North America, it's the distance from Toronto to Orlando. And if you're in Europe, it's, I guess, the beaches of the English Channel all the way down to the bottom of Italy. So it's pretty massive. It covers 3 separate state jurisdictions. You have Commonwealth legislation across the top of all of that. And then you have the small matter of dealing with all the local governments and regional governments in sort of central regional New South Wales, Victoria and Queensland. So I think that the number there is about 50 to 100, I'm not quite sure. You add offsets into that mix as well as all your approvals, it gets pretty challenging, and I guess that's the perspective that I'd like to bring to the discussion this morning. But I think we'd all understand and know that in the modern world we live in, infrastructure is a bit of a necessary evil, but when you seek to plan, design and build, you do your best to following the hierarchy of control that Chris has already talked about to avoid, mitigate, minimise, mitigate and offset. And I think offsets do provide an opportunity or an option for providers or infrastructure providers and project proponents to think about the way they treat the impacts, the unavoidable impacts of the projects that they seek to deliver. And there are, I guess, a bit of a wish list, and Chris and Alan have already sort of hit on some of the challenges that proponents face, and it is a little bit self-indulgent, I guess, perhaps in the viewpoint of the proponent, but there's certainly, we do request and require and sort of would like to have policy certainty. I think we'd all know, a lot of people know in Australia that there's been, I guess, quite a bit of movement in offset policy from the sort of the 2000s to where we are today. So I guess proponents do like certainty, I guess, when they're making decisions, particularly significant capital investment decisions. Clarity, it'd be nice to have some clarity in the removal of vagueness in policy, as well as protection. If an offset is identified, secured and starting to be managed, is it actually protected if you even have a legal protection mechanism? I think there's a few examples that have been sort of well documented in media and stories. You know, the Bimblebox Nature Refuge, which was secured as an offset for a project. Lo and behold, it's right in the firing line for another project. So does protection actually equal protection? I sort of mentioned earlier about the complexity of the different layers of government in Australia. Gee, it'd be nice if they all sort of coordinated their efforts a bit better. We have some states that have bilateral agreements between state and Commonwealth for offset policy purposes. It'd be nice if there was perhaps some reform, I guess, at that level as well. And flexibility, I guess this one's a bit indulgent on my behalf, but as a proponent who's seeking to deliver a fairly substantial piece of infrastructure, I guess we call it a program of projects. We've had to separate it up into 13 separate projects for the ease of its delivery. You think about if we apply the black and white of the policy and the legislation, you're going to have a patchwork quilt of offsets between Victoria and Queensland, which I think we'd all agree isn't probably the best outcome. Maybe there's some opportunity there to think about how we package up individual projects. I think there was some discussion earlier about Maybe if there's other adjacent projects nearby, could there be some strategic coordination between project proponents working with government to come up with the best possible outcomes for conservation? And maybe just a few little observations on my behalf. There's probably better people qualified to talk about where we move forward in offsets if we're going to persist with it as a policy lever available. But I just wonder, is there any opportunity to think about other policy fields and how they've been able to encourage, I guess, shifts in behaviour and adaptation? There's the popular book and thought piece by Richard Thaler and Sunstein about nudge theory, popularised, I guess, by the Behavioural Insights team in 10 Downing Street and the White House, and they had some pretty interesting results on a sort of small scale, sort of social policy sort of stuff, but it really had some pretty interesting outcomes. I just wonder if there's any opportunity there for us to think about the mechanism that they had. They had some randomised controlled trials as part of their investigation and evidence base to come up with before they pulled the lever on broad scale policy implementation. Wouldn't that be nice if we had some controlled trials on offset delivery and effectiveness? Maybe it would take some significant political will, but we might actually get some real evidence to know whether the policies are actually working or intended as they are. Embracing and using science, that's just like a no-brainer, isn't it? It'd really nice if society could get back onto the valuing of science and engagement and buy-in. I think we'd all know that the engagement on conservation, I guess, broadly across the society is probably not where we'd like it to be, and I think there's a role there for all stakeholders in the game, project proponents, the government, community organisations, and traditional owners and custodians of the land as well to come up with some strategies that highlight the benefits of conservation. I think we all know that there's a whole lot of them there that we should take a hold of and use to our benefit. Evolution or revolution, it's a hard one, isn't it, for practitioners? But I think there's just a little closing note, a little quote that I like, which sort of gives us hope to all, or maybe a push to agitate for some more change, and that is, if we want to better the future, we have to be willing to disturb the present. So, thank you very much.